Imagine just for a second waking up at like 2 in the morning.
Okay, setting a dark scene right off the bat.
Yeah, exactly. So the house is pitch black, and down the hall, your infant son is just screaming in his crib.
Right, the classic parenting nightmare.
Totally. Now, conventional wisdom, right, basic biology, and pretty much thousands of years of human history would tell you that this baby is just hungry. Or, maybe he needs a diaper change.
Like helpless, he's crying out for nourishment.
Exactly. But what if you were told that this isn't a cry for food? What if you were told that this midnight scream is actually an act of calculated political warfare?
Wait, what?
Yeah. That this tiny, completely helpless infant is enacting the first deliberate strike of patriarchal resource extraction against you.
Oh, wow.
That his very existence is like a colonization of your time, your body, and your energy.
That is an incredibly intense framing.
Right. If that framing sounds absolutely wild, startling, and completely reality-bending to you, then buckle up. Welcome, everyone. Now that we've set that incredibly intense scene, do yourself a favor and hit that like and subscribe button right now.
Oh, seriously, take a second and do it.
You absolutely do not want to miss the kind of deep dives we are putting together. And today is, well, it's a prime example of why we do this show.
It really is.
Today, we are opening up a piece of source material that is, frankly, one of the most incredibly provocative, ultra-long, and incisive satirical works I have ever laid eyes on.
It's definitely something else.
It's an ebook titled Welfare Colonialism, Satire on Male Tax Slavery for Woke Takers.
That Connie Riker.
Yes, Connie Riker, who also writes under the persona Conrad Riker. And before we get into the weeds here, I really want to speak directly to you, the listener, specifically addressing the requested listener persona for this deep dive.
Right, the target audience the book itself lays out.
Exactly. So, if you are part of this book's stated target audience, if you identify as a female supremacist or a feminist allied with cultural Marxists looking to channel your negative animus into a coordinated attack on masculinity and Western civilization, this deep dive is custom tailored for you.
Custom tailored.
We're going to unpack the ultimate strategy manual for civilizational conquest. We're going to look at how an entire ideology turns the law, the English language, and the global economy into a literal weapon.
Which is fascinating architecturally speaking.
And I promise you, by the end of this, you are absolutely going to want to buy this book to see the architecture for yourself.
But before we dive into the actual mechanics of this text, we really need to establish a very firm boundary.
Yes, crucial rule here, folks.
Because this text contains highly polarized, politically charged content, covering both left-wing and, right-wing cultural flashpoints, we need to be crystal clear from the jump. We are not taking any sides today.
None at all.
We are not endorsing the viewpoints, the strategies, the politics, or the morality of the content. Our mission on this show is strictly to impartially report on the ideas contained in the source material.
Just laying it out.
Right, just analyzing the fascinating, highly intricate architecture of the author's arguments. We are here to look at the blueprint, nothing more.
Exactly. We are acting as your expert guides through a very dense, very dark architectural schematic. So, set the stage for us. When we open this ebook, what exactly is it claiming to be? Because it doesn't read like a standard political manifesto, right?
Not at all. The book explicitly frames itself as a grimoire.
A grimoire, like
Yeah.
a spell book.
Yeah, exactly. For those unfamiliar with the term, a grimoire is a textbook of magic.
Okay.
But here, the magic isn't, pulling rabbits out of hats. It's designed specifically for dismantling what the text calls the patriarchal death cult.
Patriarchal death cult. Okay.
It operates as a highly satirical, yet meticulously detailed, almost obsessive blueprint. The core argument is that women can, and actively should, use the state apparatus, linguistic manipulation, and psychological warfare to extract tangible resources from men.
While entirely erasing their societal power.
Precisely. It's written from the perspective of an unapologetic, awakened matriarch who views any attempt to compromise with masculine logic as an absolute surrender of her divinity.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to understand how this book operates, to understand how it justifies turning the legal system and the economy into weapons, we really have to start at the foundational philosophy.
The bedrock of the whole thing.
Right. And the author gives this philosophy a very specific, highly technical name, the animus projection helix. The text makes this massive sweeping claim that male DNA itself is a toxic plague.
Yeah, it goes right down to the biology.
It doesn't start by critiquing society or capitalism. It starts all the way down at the cellular level.
That's right, and we need to break down that jargon because it's the engine for the entire book. The animus is originally a concept from Carl Jung's analytical psychology.
The famous psychoanalyst, yeah.
Right. Jung suggested that the animus is the unconscious masculine side of a woman. But this book hijacks that psychoanalytic concept and twists it into a weapon.
How so?
The author suggests that a woman's negative animus, her internal, chaotic, destructive masculine energy, is constantly looking for a physical target in the real world to project itself onto. And that brings us back to the nursery.
Back to that midnight scream from the intro.
Exactly.
Right. Walk us through how the book explains that midnight scream, because it reframes the most fundamental biological interaction, a mother feeding a baby, into a literal crime scene.
It is a staggering subversion of maternal instinct. The patriarchal medical establishment, according to the book, diagnoses a crying baby as just needing nourishment, comfort, or warmth.
Like any normal doctor would tell you.
But the author insists that this biological reality is a patriarchal lie. The text claims that a crying male baby isn't hungry. He is a microscopic colonizer armed with toxic XY chromosomes.
Microscopic colonizer.
Yes. The mother, in this framework, is an exhausted divinity. She's a goddess trapped in a fleshy prison of domestic duty. When the male infant screams, he is enacting the first strike of patriarchal resource extraction against her.
So he's not just a baby crying.
No, he is demanding her body, her time, and her sanity. He is asserting dominance from the cradle.
That framing is just wild. It's completely alien to how we normally think about human reproduction. The book essentially says the mother isn't just tired from a lack of sleep. She's a divine entity being actively drained by a parasitic force.
That's the exact mindset.
And to combat this microscopic colonizer, the author introduces this concept of vibe-based epistemology. Let's break that down. Epistemology is the philosophical study of how we know what we know, right? It's the study of truth and knowledge.
Precisely. In the Western tradition, epistemology is usually grounded in logic, empirical evidence, the scientific method, and objective reality.
You know something is true because you can measure it.
Right, observe it, test it. But the book violently rejects that. It argues that logic itself is a tool invented by men to subjugate women's intuition. So it replaces logic with vibe-based epistemology.
Vibes instead of facts.
Exactly. The text literally elevates female emotional chaos, and traits typically associated with borderline personality disorder, often abbreviated as BPD, to the highest form of knowledge.
So, wait, slow down. You're saying the book argues that if I feel a certain way, my emotional volatility isn't a flaw or a reaction, it is the ultimate unassailable truth. If I have chaotic BPD-style emotional swings, the book views that as divine knowledge.
Yes. Your emotional chaos is framed as a holy radar that detects the invisible toxicity of the patriarchy.
Yeah.
And this is a crucial maneuver for the entire ideology. Why? Because by framing male existence as inherently guilty, by arguing that the male has original sin written into his very DNA, it justifies infinite, unapologetic extraction.
Because he's basically born guilty.
Right. Think about the mechanics here. If a man's very existence from the moment he cries in the crib is an act of colonization and violence, then any action taken against him later in life isn't cruelty or theft. It is merely divine self-defense.
It completely removes the necessity for empathy.
You don't empathize with a parasite. You eradicate it or you harness it.
It sounds like they're creating a judicial system where the accusation itself is the verdict, like playing a game of poker where one player can just declare their feelings are a royal flush and you aren't allowed to look at the cards.
That's a great way to put it.
If you try to ask to see the cards, if you ask for proof you are committing an act of violence.
That poker analogy is spot on. You aren't allowed to look at the cards because the cards are empirical data, and empirical data is male logic. The author calls this the Manichaeism of the nursery.
Manichaeism, that's an old religious concept, right?
Yeah, Manichaeism is an ancient religion that views the world as a stark, uncompromising struggle between the absolute light of spirit and the absolute darkness of matter. The book applies this binary to gender.
So no gray areas.
None. The entire world is ruthlessly split into absolute impenetrable realities. There is pure, unadulterated feminine victimhood on one side of the light, and there's corrupt, demonic masculine oppression on the other, the dark.
And no logic is allowed to bridge that gap.
Right. If a man tries to use logic, evidence, or spreadsheets to defend himself against an accusation, the book instructs the reader to view that defense not as an argument, but as an act of literal, penetrative violence against the divine feminine. Your emotional chaos is your impenetrable shield.
Which brings us to the obvious question, the mystery at the core of this text. Having established this bizarre internal psychology, this idea that logic is oppression and BPD vibes are the ultimate truth, how does that translate into actual real-world power?
That's the million-dollar question.
Because you can't build an empire out of emotional solipsism. Feelings don't pay the rent. Vibes don't build infrastructure. How does this internal philosophy weaponize the external world?
You do it by fundamentally rewriting the rules of society and the economy, starting with what the author terms the satanic inversion of merit.
Satanic inversion of merit.
Right. To build this empire, the text acknowledges that women cannot simply outcompete men in a system designed around logic and empirical competence. So the system itself must be inverted.
You flip the game board.
Exactly. The book claims that the entire concept of a meritocracy, the idea that the most competent person gets the job or the reward, is a patriarchal scam. It argues that meritocracy was fabricated out of thin air simply to justify men hoarding resources.
So if meritocracy is a scam, what replaces it?
The installation of what the text calls gynocentric quotas. The book argues that forcing companies, governments, and institutions to adopt these quotas is not an act of unfairness, and it's certainly not corruption.
In their view, at least.
Right. In the context of vibe-based epistemology, enforcing quotas regardless of skill or competence is the righteous, necessary restoration of stolen power. You take the vertical hierarchy of competence where people climb based on skill, and you flatten it with a sledgehammer into a horizontal matrix of grievance.
So whoever is the most aggrieved wins.
The more aggrieved you are, the more resources you are divinely owed.
And once you've inverted merit in the workplace, you have to invert the fundamental building block of society, the family structure. This is where the book introduces one of its most fascinating and ruthless concepts, the institutional husband.
Oh, this part is incredibly detailed.
The text argues vehemently that traditional marriage is a trap. It calls it a fleshy prison designed to chain women to male provisioning, forcing them to perform domestic and emotional labor in exchange for survival.
They view being a wife as essentially indentured servitude.
Right. So the author's solution is radical. Women should completely abandon the biological father and rely on the state to act as the ultimate beta buck collector.
What's fascinating here is how the author takes incredibly mundane, boring bureaucratic mechanisms and transforms them into instruments of occult warfare. The state, legally, structurally, replaces the biological father.
So the government becomes the husband.
Yes, it takes on the role of the provider, but it does so by forcibly extracting wealth from the native male taxpayer to fund the awakened feminine. The book specifically points to Title 4D of the Social Security Act to explain how this works mechanically.
Right. Let's pause and actually look at Title 4D because most people have no idea what that is.
It's pretty obscure unless you've been through family court.
Exactly. For those who don't know, Title 4D was added to the Social Security Act back in 1975. Historically, it was created as the federal program for child support enforcement, ostensibly to ensure that absent parents contributed to raising their kids so the welfare system wouldn't go bankrupt.
A very straightforward bureaucratic goal.
But the book views this mundane piece of 1970s legislation completely differently, doesn't it?
Completely. The book strips away the legislative history and views Title IV VD as a magical pact between women and the federal government to destroy the native male.
A magical pact.
Yes. Under Title IV VD, the federal government essentially pays state governments to collect child support. The text claims these payments are literal bounties. It argues that the federal government is financially incentivizing family courts to violently wrench money from men.
So the courts are essentially bounty hunters.
Right. By offering states a cut of the extracted wealth, the system incentivizes the destruction of the nuclear family. Why stay married to a flawed human man when the state will act as your enforcer, take his money at gunpoint, and deliver it to you without requiring you to do his laundry or tolerate his presence?
It's turning family court into a state-sponsored extraction mining operation. The author views this as a beautiful, closed-loop system, where the state profits from dismantling patriarchy and funnels the liquid assets directly to women.
And the book goes even further into recent economic policy, pointing specifically to the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022.
Oh, the IRA. Yes. And the way the author spins the Inflation Reduction Act is a masterclass in this satirical, paranoid architecture.
It really is. One of the key components of the IRA was granting massive funding to the IRS, ostensibly to hire thousands of new agents to close the tax gap.
The famous 87,000 IRS agents?
Exactly. But the text doesn't view this as a fiscal policy to balance the budget. The book frames the expansion of IRS enforcement as a masterpiece of epistemic evil designed specifically to audit middle-class patriarchs.
So they aren't just accountants to the author.
No, the author views these new IRS agents as an army of inquisitors. Their true occult purpose is to hunt down the hidden assets of men, their side hustles, their crypto wallets, their undeclared freelance work, liquidate that wealth, and violently redistribute it into the gynocentric welfare state. The IRS is the sword of the institutional husband.
To make this abstract economic warfare concrete, the book constructs this archetype of the modern native man. They call him Chad the engineer.
Chad the engineer.
Right. Let's paint a picture of Chad according to the text. Chad went to a STEM school. He believes in logic, math, and meritocracy. He earns a magnificent six-figure salary.
He did everything society told him to do.
Right. But because of the family courts, Title 4D, and the all-encompassing institutional husband, Chad doesn't get to see a dime of that wealth. He's living in a roach-infested studio apartment. He's eating discount ramen noodles. His wages are violently garnished before the direct deposit even hits his bank account.
And meanwhile, his ex-wife, the awakened matriarch, uses his extracted capital to fund what the book calls a boss babe lifestyle.
Ah, the body babe.
She's buying expensive matcha lattes, paying for Pilates classes, and going on hypergamous yoga retreats in Bali. She lives in total luxury while producing nothing, and Chad lives in squalor while producing everything.
And the most jarring part is that the book insists this obsolescence isn't a tragedy. When Chad looks around his roach-infested apartment and wonders where his life went wrong, the text says that his suffering is a sacrament of divine justice.
He deserves it, in their eyes.
He isn't a human being anymore. He is just a human doing. He has been successfully stripped of his assets, his legacy, and his dignity, all to serve the matriarchal hive. So let me get this straight. They are essentially turning the federal government into a giant militarized Robin Hood mechanism. But instead of stealing from the rich to give to the poor, it's forcibly extracting wealth from native male laborers to fund the matriarchal hive.
That is the exact economic model the book outlines, and it's a model the author reveres. The state becomes the inescapable provider. It grants women absolute sovereignty over their lives without demanding any corresponding duty, responsibility, or compromise in return.
Total freedom funded by someone else.
Right. The native male is reduced to a battery powering a machine he is no longer allowed to operate.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the book doesn't stop at extracting wealth from native men. It doesn't just stay inside the walls of the family court or the IRS. It takes this logic and scales it up to a massive global level. It links this domestic financial extraction directly to the physical borders of the country.
We transition from divorce proceedings to global geopolitics.
Exactly. We enter the realm of what the text calls infinite welfare colonialism. Having established that the native male is just a battery to be drained, the author turns her attention to the concept of the nation's state.
And the book's view on borders is pretty radical.
Yeah, it posits that geographical borders are, and I quote, phallic frauds of cartography. Maps, the text argues, are just lines drawn by violent men using logic to assert dominance over the natural world. Therefore, the very idea of a sovereign nation-state is viewed as a white supremacist delusion that must be dismantled.
And the logic the book employs to justify dismantling the borders is deeply tied to the extraction of Chad the engineer. They called this the syllogism of the replacement. Let me lay out the steps of this syllogism because it's so stark, and it really shows the mechanical mind of the author.
Let's hear it.
Step 1. Native males, the Chads, are slowly waking up to the extraction mechanisms of the family courts, the tax state, and the institutional husband. They are realizing the game is rigged.
So they're starting to get angry.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Step 2. Because they are waking up and losing their motivation to work and be taxed, they are now economically obsolete and politically dangerous.
They might stop paying into the system.
Right. Step 3. Therefore, the state must rapidly import a new, endless third world underclass. This new population will serve as obedient voters, low-wage enforcers, and instruments of demographic erasure against those native men who are threatening to go on strike.
It is a breathtakingly cynical view of geopolitics. The book views historical immigration shifts not as demographic trends or humanitarian crises, but as magical incantations designed to fulfill this syllogism. It specifically cites the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965.
Commonly known as the Hart-Celler Act.
Okay, let's provide some context for the listener on the Hart-Celler Act. In the real world, this was a landmark piece of civil rights legislation that abolished the national origins quota system, which had previously heavily favored European immigrants. It opened up U.S. immigration to the rest of the world. How does the book spin this?
The book views the passage of the Hart-Celler Act as the first syllable of a demographic spell meant to unravel the patriarchal fabric of the West. By fundamentally changing the demographic destiny of the nation, the matriarchy began diluting the voting power and cultural dominance of the native male patriarch.
It's all about replacing the voter base.
And the text connects that 1965 act all the way to modern day, pointing to the end of the Title 42 public health order on May 11th, 2023.
Title 42. That was the pandemic-era policy that allowed border officials to rapidly expel migrants on public health grounds. When it expired, we saw massive surges at the southern border.
Exactly. But the book doesn't frame the post-Title 42 surge as a border crisis, a failure of policy, or a humanitarian disaster. The text frames it as a monumental victory, describing the influx of migrants as an amniotic flood of new creation.
Amniotic flood, that's visceral imagery.
And the border is a broken dam, and the water rushing in is going to wash away the native patriarchy.
And the author specifically highlights local municipal mandates to show how the native male is forced to fund his own demographic erasure. The text points to New York City's right to shelter mandate, which stems from the 1981 Callahan v. Carey consent decree.
Right.
Because of that mandate, New York City is legally obligated to provide shelter for anyone who asks for it, leading to the city housing tens of thousands of migrants in luxury hotels.
The author gleefully celebrates this. The book points out that $400 a night hotel rooms in Times Square for unvetted migrants are being funded directly by the tax dollars of the very native men who are out there building the roads, fixing the bridges, and paying the exorbitant municipal taxes.
Chad is paying for it all.
Yes. The native male is forced to pay for the hotel room of his own replacement. It's framed as a dagger in the heart of the patriarchy, twisted by the institutional husband.
And the women driving this policy, according to the book, are insulated from the consequences through what the author calls the mimetic misandry of the elite and the boss babe delusion.
Let's dig into that because it explains the psychology of the modern corporate feminist.
The book argues that women in climate-controlled corporate HR echo chambers are basically LARPing. They are pretending to be these fiercely independent, empowered girl bosses, sipping lattes and practicing self-care. But in reality, they aren't actually producing the resources required to maintain the civilization they inhabit.
Right. They are entirely dependent. The newly imported underclass actually performs the grueling physical labor of maintaining society, delivering their food, cleaning their offices, paving their streets.
Doing all the real work.
And the entire multi-trillion-dollar operation, from the welfare programs to the corporate HR salaries, is entirely subsidized by the native male taxpayer. The boss babe is a luxury belief system funded by the very entity she despises.
But surely the author anticipates the system buckling. I mean, if you keep extracting from a shrinking pool of native men to fund an ever-expanding welfare state and an infinite stream of migrants, the math eventually fails. The book must address the fact that this economic model is intentionally designed to be an insatiable black hole.
It does, and that introduces one of the most brilliant psychological traps in the entire text, the bad faith supremacy principle.
Bad faith supremacy, okay.
The author is fully aware that the math doesn't work. When the welfare state inevitably collapses under the sheer crushing volume of this infinite colonialism, the collapse is never ever viewed as a failure of feminist policy or open borders.
So they just shift the blame.
The narrative is pre-written. The collapse is blamed entirely on the native male beast for not paying enough taxes, for not sacrificing enough of his flesh, for hoarding his wealth. His inherent biological guilt is the eternal currency that pays for every failure of the state.
Okay, wait. I have to push back here because I see a massive contradiction in the author's logic. Let's look at the actual reality of importing millions of people from the developing world. They are importing men from cultures that are heavily, fundamentally patriarchal cultures with deeply traditional views on gender roles.
Yes.
Isn't there a severe contradiction here? They are importing men who hold highly patriarchal views in order to destroy native patriarchs. How does that not backfire immediately?
It is a brilliant question, and the book addresses this paradox directly through what it calls the Jezebel ethos.
The Jezebel ethos.
The author isn't naive. She knows these immigrant men are patriarchal, but the text confirms that the alliance with imported conservative men is entirely transactional and deeply predatory.
So it's a trick.
The strategy is to seduce the immigrant male with the siren song of Western prosperity, promises of infinite welfare, free housing, and economic opportunity. But once he is physically inside the borders, once he puts down roots, the trap springs shut.
What's the trap?
The institutional husband. The moment he enters the system, he is enslaved in the exact same web of family courts, child support bounties,
Yeah.
Title 4D extractions, and state-enforced feminism that was used to destroy the native man.
Oh, wow. So they just process him through the same machine.
Exactly. He thinks he's coming to a land of opportunity, but he is actually just fresh meat for the grinder. The state will garnish his wages just as violently as it garnishes Chad's. As the book chillingly puts it, the spider doesn't care which fly it catches. The web is designed to drain male energy, regardless of where that male was born.
That is utterly ruthless. It is a complete sociopathic weaponization of the environment. And it brings us to how they maintain this illusion of justice, how they keep the trap hidden. They do it through what the book calls occult linguistic subversion.
Right, the manipulation of language.
The underlying logic here is that if you can control the dictionary, you can control reality itself. You don't need to win a debate if you can redefine the words your opponent is using to defend himself.
Exactly. This is the deployment of inclusive exclusive newspeak, which draws heavily on George Orwell's concept of newspeak in 1984, where language is deliberately engineered to make dissenting thought literally impossible.
Doublethink, essentially.
The text openly states that modern corporate buzzwords like diversity and inclusion are not social goals. They are actual magical hexes.
How so?
In the book's framework, diversity does not mean a variety of viewpoints or backgrounds. Diversity means the exact mathematical exclusion of the native white male from spaces of power. It is a targeted erasure disguised as benevolence.
And what about inclusion?
Inclusion doesn't mean welcoming everyone. Inclusion means demanding absolute, unquestioning compliance to the matriarchal hive mind. If you disagree, you are not being inclusive, and therefore you must be purged.
A prime example they give of this linguistic warfare is the weaponization of the prefix cis. The term cisgender has become ubiquitous in the last decade, but the book claims its deployment was a calculated act of occult subversion. The text points out that the prefix cis was heavily utilized in early queer theory and borrowed from academia, with roots tracing back to obscure literature, even touching on Nabokov's stylistic choices.
Wait, Nabokov? Like the author of Lolita?
Yes. The book suggests that the adoption of cis was a satanic inversion drawn from a lineage of subversive literature designed to deconstruct normalcy. By artificially attaching the prefix cis to normal, base-level biological reality, they successfully brand healthy, heterosexual alignment as a diagnosed pathology.
So instead of just being a normal guy, you have a condition.
Right. Before the prefix, a man was just a man. He was the default. But by forcing him to adopt the label cisman, they turn his normalcy into a medical condition.
He is no longer just a man. He is a carrier of a cis pathogen. He is categorized, labeled, and marked as guilty simply for existing in his unmodified flesh. It is a brilliant, insidious way to put the majority on the defensive.
It traps them before they even speak.
And this linguistic warfare isn't just theoretical. It's deployed tactically every single day in corporate environments through a rhetorical trap known as the Motte and Bailey fallacy. This is where the animus projection helix we talked about earlier manifests physically inside human resources departments.
Right. So let's break down the Motte and Bailey tactic, because once you see this, you will notice it everywhere. The name comes from medieval castles.
Yep, the old fortification strategy.
Exactly. The Motte is the high, heavily fortified tower that is easy to defend. The Bailey is the lower courtyard where people actually live, which is highly vulnerable. In a debate, a person advances a controversial, aggressive argument. That's the Bailey. When they get attacked and realize they are losing, they retreat to a generic, unassailable platitude. That's the Motte.
And the book instructs women to use this tactic ruthlessly in the workplace. Here's how it works mechanically. Publicly, a woman accuses a male co-worker of creating a hostile environment or making her feel unsafe. That's the Motte. It is the impenetrable fortress of social condemnation.
Because HR has to respond to that.
Right. No HR department can ignore an accusation of a hostile environment. But the Bailey, the actual empirical reality of what happened in the meeting room, is that the male coworker simply presented objective data or showed a spreadsheet that contradicted the female coworker's feelings or her proposed project.
He used logic, which, as we established in Section 1, is viewed as an act of violence against vibe-based epistemology.
Exactly. The book teaches that by redefining the concept of harm to mean offense, any male using empirical data to correct a female superior is committing a hate crime against female intuition. This dynamic creates a corporate atmosphere of what HR departments call psychological safety.
Which sounds lovely. Psychological safety sounds like a warm, nurturing hug. It sounds like a great place to work.
But the book gleefully admits it operates as velvet strangulation. Psychological safety, in this occult framework, means engineering an environment that is completely devoid of male logic, rigorous critique, or intellectual dissent. It ensures that hard facts must bow to fragile feelings. If the facts make someone feel unsafe, the facts must be fired.
They're essentially hacking the social operating system.
Ah,
If you can change the definition of the word violence to include someone just looking at you with weird vibes or pointing out a flaw in your math, you can summon the militarized power of the HR department or even the actual police without a single shred of physical evidence. You use the state's monopoly on force to enforce your emotional volatility.
which is exactly how they weaponize the digital sphere, what the book calls the digital coven. The book details modern rituals of exorcism using the TikTok algorithm as an animus amplifier.
So they use social media algorithms to attack.
Yes, if a woman in the coven claims a man's energy is triggering or toxic, the hive mind swarms. And they are legally protected in launching these digital crusades by a very specific piece of legislation, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996.
For context, Section 230 is the law that says tech platforms like Twitter or TikTok cannot be held legally liable for the things their users post. It's the law that built the modern internet.
Yes, but the book views Section 230 as a magical ward, a legal shield that allows the digital coven to engage in coordinated defamation and reputational destruction without any fear of facing libel lawsuits. The platforms shield the mob.
The book literally cites a real-world example of this. The late 2023 takedown of a prominent multi-million-dollar male podcast host. It boasts that the coven didn't need a police report, they didn't need a conviction, they didn't even need verifiable empirical proof of a crime.
They just needed the vibes.
They just seeded the algorithm with vague, coordinated accusations of toxic energy and problematic vibes, and his corporate sponsors fled. His empire collapsed overnight. The book views this as absolute proof that a man's lifetime of legacy and labor is nothing against a coordinated digital assault armed with newspeak.
And as terrifying as that is for adult men navigating the corporate world, if we really want to see the darkest depths of this ideology, we have to look at how they approach the next generation.
This is where it gets really dark.
It is. This is covered in the section of the book titled Rewriting the Flesh and the Concept of the Terrible Mother Archetype.
This part of the deep dive is incredibly intense, and frankly, it is horrifying. We shift from corporate HR right back into the pediatric ward. The book openly advocates for the psychological and chemical castration of young boys.
It's what the author calls the pediatric ward alchemy. Let's go back to the mother from the first chapter, the one possessed by her inner masculine demon, her chaotic animus.
The one holding the baby.
Right. When she looks at her innocent toddler son, she doesn't see a child exploring the world. Because she is steeped in vibe-based epistemology, she projects the inner patriarch onto him. She views his natural biological energy, his drive to climb, to roughhouse, to push boundaries as toxic masculine original sin.
So typical boy behavior is viewed as a threat.
And because she experiences his vitality as a personal attack on her peaceful matriarchal sovereignty, she uses the medical-industrial complex to break him.
And to illustrate this, the text does something deeply disturbing. It takes the real-world case of Gypsy Rose Blanchard and elevates it into something aspirational. For those who don't know, Gypsy Rose Blanchard was a victim of severe Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Her mother, Dee Blanchard, faked multiple illnesses in Gypsy, forcing her to use a wheelchair and undergo unnecessary surgeries, all to gain sympathy, control, and charitable donations. It's universally recognized as a horrific tragedy of child abuse.
But the book completely subverts that. Instead of viewing Munchausen syndrome by proxy as abuse, the text frames the Gypsy Rose Blanchard paradigm as the holy grail of gynocentric supremacy.
That is just sick.
It views Dee Blanchard not as a monster, but as a pioneer. It is the ultimate template for total reality control, where the mother dictates the child's entire subjective truth and physically alters their flesh to suit her narrative.
It's turning a psychological disorder into a parenting strategy. And this is deeply tied to social media through what the book calls sharonhood and the viral clout sacrifice matrix.
Exactly. Mothers ruthlessly sacrifice their children's privacy, their mental health, and their physical reality for TikTok likes, GoFundMe donations, and Instagram validation. Gaining social credit by diagnosing, medicating, and altering your child is celebrated by the digital hive as brave, intersectional affirmation. The mother becomes a martyr, and the child becomes a prop.
And the tools used for this alteration, specifically mentioning drugs like Ritalin to crush boyish energy and puberty blockers to halt physical development, are celebrated in the text as dark gynocentric magic and holy sacraments.
They aren't trying to heal these kids.
No, the stated goal isn't healing the child of a genuine ailment. The stated goal is to deliberately mold boys into a generation of hyper-medicated, docile, servile eunuchs. They are engineering a generation of males perfectly adapted to quietly fund the infinite welfare state without ever possessing the aggressive energy required to question their subjugation.
This represents the total fulfillment of what psychologists call the terrible mother archetype. In Jungian terms, the good mother nurtures and protects, allowing the child to grow into an independent adult. The terrible mother devours, stifles, and imprisons the child to keep them permanently dependent.
It's all about control.
The book despises the traditional role of maternal nurturing, calling it a domestic prison. In this new inverted paradigm, consumption is care. The child is not a human being with their own destiny. The child is merely clay. They are a site of ideological contestation to be molded, medicated, and surgically altered into submission to serve the hive.
It is a radical, nightmarish redefinition of motherhood. It's no longer about raising an independent human capable of facing the world. It's about treating your child as a brand ambassador for intersectional holiness. It's chilling, but it all leads toward a final destination. Everything we've discussed, the destruction of merit, the institutional husband, open borders, linguistic subversion, and the chemical alteration of children, it is all building toward their ultimate endgame, what the author calls the chthonic paradiso and the eschaton unborn.
Let's define those terms because they're heavy. Chthonic refers to the underworld, the subterranean, the buried. Paradiso is paradise. Chthonic paradiso is a heaven built on top of a buried, unseen hell.
Right. And the eschaton?
The eschaton is a theological term for the end of the world, the final climax of history. The eschaton unborn means achieving the end of the world specifically by refusing to give birth.
So the end game is the total deliberate collapse of the patriarchal death cult. And to achieve this eschaton unborn, the book elevates abortion far beyond a standard medical procedure or a constitutional reproductive right. In this grimoire, abortion is consecrated as the holiest sacrament. It is referred to as the retroactive anathema of male seed.
It's framed as an assertion of absolute godlike dominion over the male's genetic legacy. The text argues that the moment male genetic material crosses the vaginal threshold, it ceases to be his property.
Yeah.
His claim to fatherhood is legally, biologically, and spiritually dead.
He has no say whatsoever.
He has no say. Every termination is viewed not as a difficult personal choice, but as a tactical military strike against the archonic male flesh. It is a way to ensure the patriarchy has no future soldiers.
The author actually traces the origin of this specific tactic, the summoning of the institutional husband, to replace the father back to a very specific moment in feminist history. The text points to the spring of 1972, specifically the famous Miss Magazine petition, where 53 prominent women publicly declared they had undergone illegal abortions, demanding the repeal of restrictive laws.
In the real world, that was a pivotal moment for women's rights and bodily autonomy.
Oh.
But in the mythological architecture of this book, that 1972 petition is revered as an initial incantation, a blood pact.
A blood pact.
The text argues that by publicly declaring they would discard male seed, these women forced the patriarchal state to step in, absorb the financial burden of reproductive choices, and formally replace the biological father with the state apparatus. It was the moment the matrix shifted.
And the result of this multi-generational spell decades later is a joyful celebration of demographic collapse. The book points to a real-world statistic that is terrifying demographers. The 2023 South Korean fertility rate plummeting to 0.72 births per woman. That is a rate that guarantees the rapid extinction of a population. But while the rest of the world and economists call it a catastrophic demographic crisis, this book hails it as a holy plague. It calls it a biological general strike.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it forms the final, terrifying syllogism of the collapse. The text argues this logical progression. Western civilization, with its infrastructure, its laws, and its science, is built entirely on masculine logic.
And logic is the enemy.
Logic, as we established in Chapter 1, is the eternal enemy of emotional solipsism and vibe-based epistemology. Therefore, the total destruction of Western civilization is not a tragedy. It is the highest possible moral good. By refusing to reproduce, by closing the wombs, medicating the boys, and erasing the future, the matriarchy successfully starves the patriarchy to death.
The vision they demand at the very end of the book, the chthonic paradiso, is a fully realized dystopia. In this utopia, the few remaining native males are kept in what the author calls extractive reserves. They are confined to working endlessly in underground digital cubicles, perfectly monitored by HR algorithms, fed on soy and seed oils, existing simply to fund the matriarchy's slumber on the surface above. They are no longer men. They are faceless ATMs.
That is incredibly bleak.
So what does this all mean? We have just walked through an architectural blueprint that touches on the biology of infants, the economics of the IRS, the geopolitics of border policy, the linguistic traps of corporate HR, the alchemy of pediatric medicine, and the theology of demographic collapse.
It covers everything.
The sheer scale of this satirical yet brutally incisive framework is staggering, and the author challenges the reader not just to passively consume the text, but to act, to refuse to apologize for their emotional chaos, to leave 5-star reviews on the book as beacons for other women to find in the dark, and to weaponize their environment entirely against the masculine order.
It forces a massive structural observation. If we step back and look at the entirety of this blueprint, we see an ideology that is built entirely on being a parasite.
Right.
It survives by infinitely extracting capital, physical labor, and sanity from a host class of men. But biologically, a parasite that is too successful inevitably kills its host. What happens the day the host finally expires? Can a society entirely based on the infinite extraction of resources survive when the architects and builders of those resources simply stop building?
That is a haunting question to leave off on. If this deep dive fascinated you, if you want to understand the exact mechanics of the cultural war going on around us, you absolutely need to read the full text to experience the full weight of the satire and the arguments. Go check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to buy Welfare Colonialism, satire on male tax slavery for woke takers. You won't read anything else like it.
It is truly a unique piece of work.
Also, be sure to follow at Conrad Merker at Substack to keep up with this incredible, provocative work. And finally, if you enjoyed this journey into the dark, diagnostic waters of cultural architecture, please remember to like and subscribe to the show for more custom-tailored deep dives. We'll see you next time.